Hello, I'm Ashley and I'm a marine ecologist. I work for two different organisations, both related to the marine environment and marine conservation. I'm a researcher at Newcastle University studying the impacts of marine fisheries, and I also work for Groundwork North Eastern Cumbria on a specific marine restoration project called the Wild Oysters Project, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So the Wild Oysters Project is a new partnership between the Zoological Society of London, Blue Marine Foundation and British Marine, and it's funded by the People's Postcode Lottery Dream Fund. Here in the northeast of England, the local delivery partners are Groundwork North Eastern Cumbria and the Environment Agency, and together as a group we aim to restore native oyster populations back to self-sustaining levels in UK seas where they can thrive and provide lots of different benefits. So first, let's go back to the beginning and talk about what oysters are, why they matter and why they need our help. So they are marine bivalves, which is a type of mollusk, and they have two shells joined by a hinge which can open and close. And they look like this. There are lots of different species of oyster, but this is the European oyster, also called native or flat oyster, and these are the species which we're trying to restore. They live at the bottom of the sea, down to about 50 metres depth, but what's really special about oysters is the way they form oyster reefs. And oyster reefs are complex 3D structures made up of oysters and old oyster shells stuck together, and it's this that provides the habitat and food for lots and lots of different species. So on an oyster reef, the little gaps and crevices in between the oyster shells form shelter and little hidey holes for species such as crabs and juvenile fish. For example, here you can see a brittle star living in and around oysters. But the oyster shells themselves also provide habitat. They provide a hard substrate for different organisms to attach to, and we call these organisms epibionts, which means that they live attached to another living thing. For example, here you can see this really well on this image by the Forever Project in France. You can see lots of different species growing on top of the oyster shell at the right hand side, creating really diverse marine communities. And here again, where the oyster in the middle is almost camouflaged by the other organisms growing on top. So another advantage of oysters is that they actually clean the water. So they're filter feeders, which means they collect tiny little particles out of the seawater for food. And they can do this at a remarkable rate for up to 240 litres of seawater per oyster per day. And here you can see this in action. So here we have oysters in the tank on the right that are filtering the water over a period of just a few hours. And you can see the water where the oysters are is clean at the end, whereas the empty tank remains really cloudy. So hopefully you can see that oysters are really great to have around in the sea, and they provide lots of different services. Unfortunately, around the UK they're not very common anymore. They've actually declined by over 95% in the last 150 years due to a number of different factors, including overfishing, habitat loss, pollution and disease. In fact, here in the northeast we don't have any oyster reefs remaining. In the Tyne and Wear Oyster Rehabilitation Hub, where I work, we aim to bring oysters back to the northeast coast. And my colleagues in Scotland and Wales are doing the same in their local hubs so that we have a joined up national approach. There are two major hurdles to overcome in an oyster restoration project, and the first is the fact that there aren't enough oysters left in the wild to reproduce naturally. And the second is the lack of suitable substrate for the oysters to settle on when they do breed. So we plan to overcome both of these obstacles. So to overcome the issue of the natural breeding, we are installing oyster nurseries in local marinas, and these will look like this. With lots of adult oysters living inside, they will be suspended under the water in marinas, and they will be able to reproduce and will release over 9 billion larvae, which are baby oysters, into the sea over 3 years. And these nurseries, like oyster reefs, also create habitat for lots of different species in the marina. Here you can see some of the underwater footage from a oyster restoration project in the Solent, which shows the types of creatures you'll find living in, on and around the nurseries, like encrusting species like sponges, as well as little shrimps and fish. It's really diverse communities. So now that we've solved the larvae issue, we still need to solve somewhere for them to settle and grow into adult oysters. And oyster larvae, or spat, are known to be extremely fussy home hunters, and they like to find a spot on the seabed that has gravel and shells, specifically old oyster shells, and they also like to be near adults of the same species. And there are very few places like this left in the northeast especially the seabed here. So we need to try and create these kind of habitats to encourage the larvae to settle and grow into mature oyster reefs. So to do this, we plan to add oyster culch, it's called, which is oyster shells and gravel, to the seabed in the best possible location that we think oysters would like to settle. And hopefully this will mean that we can generate reefs offshore in the northeast. So hopefully these two restoration steps together, the oyster nurseries and the habitat creation, will mean that oyster reefs will reform on the northeast coast in the near future and return to self-sustaining population levels. You never know, in 30 years' time, you might be able to eat a European oyster from a sustainable northeast fishery. If you want to stay up to date with our project and check on the progress of the oysters, then please follow our social media, which is on screen now. Hopefully I've given you an interesting insight into what marine ecologists do and some of the really exciting marine conservation and restoration work ongoing on the northeast coast on your doorstep. So thanks for listening, and please do share the oyster love by telling your family and friends all about why oysters are so great and why they need our help.